Hi all, today we have to discuss about another important feature of Spring Boot, that is profiles, and how this feature helps us in our large scale project that we have to see theoretically and also have a do small hands-on. So what is profiles in Spring Boot? Profiles means that to segregation of the different component or configuration based on environment. So for example, let's say that we need a specific JDBC URL for dev environment and different JDBC URL for production. So how to segregate that? So we have to Spring Boot has given the feature to create different profiles, and based on the profile we'll have that corresponding specific configuration file, and at runtime based on the profile setup application will fetch the corresponding details. And not only the configuration, another any other bin configuration, like that if we think that okay, these some specific bin specific component are applicable only for dev and that is not for prod, or um, vice versa, that if we think okay, some component is for production and that is not applicable for dev, that component also we can segregate based on profiles. We have to see with a small hands-on how we can segregate the configuration in our application.properties based on profiles. So how to set the profiles? We can set the profiles in two ways. One is that through the property file. As all you know that we have that application.properties file in our Spring Boot resource file. On that resource file we can add that corresponding configuration spring.profiles.active. That will be the key, and value will be the corresponding profile name. So it may be dev, it may be prod, it may be UAT, or whatever. So you can set your profile against that key, and once the Spring Boot application will start, Spring Boot will register the profile against that key. So means that it will read that key and it will fetch the value, and that value will be set into a Spring Boot, and based on that profile Spring Boot will fetch the corresponding details. Other way around, what we can do, we can as we all we know that Spring Boot application can be executed by a simple Java application in the Java minus jar. So once we have to run that Spring Boot application, a simple Java application, definitely we can pass the argument also. So in that command line argument we can pass the corresponding spring.profiles.active. That value we can pass in our Spring Boot Java application with that corresponding value. So in these two way we can set the profiles, and we have to see with our small hands-on how we can set the profile in our property file. Now there is no hard and fast that okay, we need to do that set the profile in our properties or pass into the command line. But think about the scenario if we set that profile in our property file, and again once we are running the Java application we are passing that corresponding um, key corresponding argument. So which will take the precedence? That question will come. So Spring Boot takes that command line argument with the highest priority. So even if we set that profile in our properties file, Spring Boot will ignore that profile if we pass that corresponding key spring.profiles.active as an argument. So command line argument will take the highest precedence. Now another concept is that profile group. Uh, as I mentioned in this slide, that problem that let's say we are doing some fine-grained configuration, means that we have that, let's say, the database configuration as well as that message queue configuration. Instead of keeping all the configuration in one file, what we can do, we can create separate configuration file for that database as well as the message queue. So this is a fine-grained configuration. So now we have two configuration. that is the database and message queue. So in this case, how we'll set that profile, because here I don't have any single property file. So how will you set into the, or how will you say to Spring Boot, hey, pick up these two configuration file based on the profile. As I mentioned in the previous slide, that we can set the active profile with one value. That is like that in this slide I am displaying that the spring dot profiles dot, like that. If you see this is a spring dot active dot production. So this is the active profile which we are setting into our configuration file. So based on this value production, that Spring Boot will pick up that corresponding property file. Now how will we pick up the fine grained property file? Here the profile group concept is coming. So what we can do, we can create that profile group. Like if you see, this is the profile group, right? This is the profile group. This is the keyword spring.profiles.group. This is a profile group. And next what we can do, we can add that corresponding profile name. Whatever the profile name we have to set against the spring.profiles.active, that profile name we need to add, and that is an array. So this is a group. So we can say that, okay, first profile is that prod db, another we can say the prod mq. So now we are saying to the Spring Boot, hey, use the profile as active as production, and also use that profile group, that the prod db and prod mq. So based on that prod db and prod mq, the Spring Boot will pick up that corresponding file. We will have separate configuration file for prod db and prod mq, and those configuration file will be picked up. So once we'll have that, let's say for development environment, what we can do, we can create that same thing, spring.profiles.active equal to dev, and we can also add the spring.profiles.group.dev 0 equal to devdb. So we can add the multiple fine-grained configuration based on the profile in our profile group. So this is a very important means that solves that problem if we use that fine-grained configuration. Now we have to do one small hands-on on Spring Boot profiles. Till now we have discussed about the theoretical concept, what is Spring Boot profiles and what is Spring Boot profile group. So we have to do now small hands-on to understand the concept which we have discussed already. So this is just one basic Spring Boot application skeleton, that is the employee management or employee application. So we have simple one employee application as a main application. We have one controller, and I have added one class as a configuration to check the configuration details in our browser. But actually this configuration needs to be invoked from the service. But to understand the Spring Boot profiles, I have added the configuration as also a controller, just to check the JDBC and message queue URL in our browser. But ideally in our real life project, this configuration should not be exposed. This configuration will be used by one employee service to perform the business logic. So these are the two URL we want to verify, that is a message queue URL and database URL, and those URL has been published on simple one request mapping method. And those URL now we have is already into our property file. So if you see, we have a lots of property file, and these are the dev prod test UAT. But for the moment, for this testing, now we have to concentrate only the application.properties. So this is the application properties, and we have the message queue URL and database URL. Now let's start the application, and we have to check the corresponding value. Then we have to start to introduce the profiles. First we have to check the corresponding message queue value and database URL value. Message is server is starting now. Yes. Now if we check our URL, if we see the get message queue URL is a default URL, right? and also if you see the database URL, that is also default database URL. So that is mapped into our default application.properties. Now what we have to do, we have to now introduce our profile concept. So what we have to do, first we have to uncomment the line number 2. So we are saying my active profile is UAT. Okay, so now UAT means user acceptance testing test profile. So for that, what we have to do, first I have to create one file like that. The profile name, whatever the profile name we have to set, we have to create that properties file application hyphen that profile name. So now you have created application hyphen UAT.properties, right? Now see here also I have given that message queue URL value and database URL value. Now if we start to check the application, I should get the corresponding UAT relevant URL. Yeah, now if we check this, see UAT database URL and here the UAT message queue URL. I have also added one test properties application.test URL. Let's say that is a test environment, simply IT testing. Now if I check the test, yes, now the server has been restarted, and if we again check, if you see, this is the test message URL, and here also if you see, that is the test JDBC URL. So whatever the active profile we have to set, that active profile based on the value, Spring Boot will find that corresponding property file, that application hyphen test.properties. But interesting thing is that if we, let's say that property file is not present, let's say application hyphen underscore test.properties file is not present, then where from this value will be retrieved? So then it will find out the value from the application test dot properties. Let's test it. Let's refactor this file. Sorry, yeah, refactor the file. Yeah, let's say test1. We can say this is the test1. Now we have set the profile as a test, but Spring Boot will not find that corresponding property file. Now if we test that URL, which value should be fetched? So as Spring Boot will not find that application hyphen test.properties, so it will try to get the value from the application.properties. So let's see. Yeah, see, this is the default JDBC URL and this is the default message queue URL. So now till now we have checked that how the profiles work. So based on that environment, so we can create the different profiles and we can set our property value in that corresponding property file. Now let's check that profile group concept. So now profile group, what the profile group is saying, profile group is saying that if we introduce our property file in the fine grained process, so means that we have to set our database configuration and queue configuration in separate file. Let's say we have one development side. Let's say we have another profile is the dev profile, and in the dev DB properties we have the database URL, and dev MQ we have that corresponding message queue URL. Same way we have the production also. We have the prod DB properties which have database URL, and also the prod MQ properties which have the prod message queue URL. So how to use our profile group concept? So now what we need to do, this is a very simple way. So first what we need to do, we need to set that profile. First what we need, let's say we are saying that this is a dev profile. Okay, now till now this is a dev profile. Now if we keep that spring.profiles.active as a dev profile, Spring Boot will try to find all the details from the application hyphen dev.properties, right? So but I want to use a specific DB configuration and message configuration file. So for that I need to here I need to add the create the group spring.profiles.group, then the profile name, then we can add our configuration in a group. So this we have added two configuration, but you can add multiple group file, multiple configuration. So now once we have to add the dev 0 equal to dev db and dev mq, Spring Boot will check all the configuration file which is started like this application hyphen dev db and dev mq, because we are saying this dev is the active profile but there is a group name, so that group has that multiple configuration. So Spring Boot will try to find all the configuration file which has been given in that group. So now if we test that hello, so we should get that corresponding dev URL from here. So development is JDBC URL and also development message queue URL. So let's see this is the development message queue URL and here this is the development JDBC URL. So now if we set the property as a production, so just for the I need to simple comment it, uncomment it. Now here we have set the profile as a production and we have set the configuration as a prod.db and prod.mq. So here we have also the prod.db and prod.mq file. So now if we see the prod.mq, we have the prod message URL, queue URL, and prod.db has the prod production database JDBC URL. So now if you see it should give the production JDBC URL and it should give the production message queue URL. So I hope you have understood how the profiles works in the Spring Boot. This is a simple two concept. One is that profiles, simple profiles, if all the properties in one file, so we can set simple profile, active profile, we can set the active profile, but if we have fine-grained property file, then we should use the profile group. I hope you have understood, and as I mentioned that wherever you think that okay, we have that chance to use this profile, so you can have a look and you can start to implement the profiles concept in our Spring Boot. Thank you all.